Back with another reading hour here. It's July 3rd, 2025. Let's get the chat set up here, get the Instagram going live. Get my noise canceling set up. Okay, now we're all set up. All right, everybody. Welcome back to another reading hour for July 3rd, 2025. Picking right back up with the Gladio book here. So, when we left off, we were talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1966, Morlean established, with funding from the CIA, the Pro Deo University, which became Libera University Internazionale degli Studi Sociali, the International University of Social Studies. As president of the new university, Morlean became a force in the formation of the right-wing policies of the Italian government. He also reportedly began recruiting terrorists and assassins, including Moretti and Mehmet Ali Agca, who attempted the hit on John Paul II. Questions about Morlean's involvement in the Moro matter first arose from the discovery of photos taken by Pecorelli of the prominent priest in the company of leading Italian military intelligence officials at the time of the kidnapping. Such questions became more pressing when the Rome office of the Hyperion School, which Morlean helped to establish, opened shortly before the Moro kidnapping, only to close the following autumn. Even more puzzling is the fact that the Pro Deo founder received prominent mention in the secret files of Licio Gelli, which were seized by the Italian police in 1982. Friar Antonio Menini, a Vatican official, served as the intermediary between Moro and his family during the time of the captivity. How Friar Menini came to serve in this capacity raises questions about the extent of the Vatican's involvement in the crime. Friar Menini, who claimed to have heard Moro's last confession, was the son of Luigi Menini, who served under the direct supervision of Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. Why would the brigadiers, avowed atheists, employ the services of a priest? And why would they seek the service of the son of a high-ranking Iowar official? Were Luigi or Antonio somehow in league with the kidnappers? Friar Menini, following Moro's death, rose through the ranks of Holy Mother Church and presently serves as the papal nuncio to Great Britain. So once again, we see another example of these people who have these suspicious dealings, who seem to have these roles where they play both sides of a conflict like that. Like, why would this priest be involved with the people who kidnapped Aldo Moro? Like this supposedly far-left militant group that's committing this crime, this terrorist act. Morning there, Shibbles. Good to see you. Yeah, and then all they do is rise in the ranks after this. They just keep failing upwards. Well, not failing. They just, they're obviously not serving the goals of like their parishioners, the people that they claim to serve, and they're serving these far-right secret militant goals. The Vatican to this day continues to shield Moro's confessor from ever having to testify in state hearings concerning the prime minister's abduction and death. How convenient. Next section here is the Bologna bombing. Gladio's role in the strategy of tension might have gone undetected, save for the massacre in Bologna. At 10:25 a.m. on August 2nd, 1980, a time bomb within an unattended suitcase exploded in the crowded, air-conditioned waiting room of the central station in Bologna, destroying most of the main building. 84 people were killed in the bombing, and more than 200 wounded, making it the most savage attack to take place on Italian soil since World War II. Blame, of course, was placed on the Red Brigades and the radical left, but there was a problem that could not be resolved by the roundup of the usual suspects. The bomb that had been used in Bologna was not an ordinary explosive. It was a sophisticated device made of TNT and composition B, a device that had been developed for use by the US military. What's more, the bomb was very similar to the explosives which the Italian police had found in the arms dump near Trieste. The planners had made a mistake that was complicated by the presence of the members of the Nuclei Armati Rivoluzione, the NAR, Armed Revolutionary Nuclei, at the train station. The NAR, like Ordine Nuovo, was a violent neo-fascist group, and its leader, Valerio Fioravanti, had been slightly injured by the blast. So another thing that gets brought up a lot when you talk about clandestine agencies or the deep states of various countries is how people first discovered the concept of a deep state, and it was when there was a car accident with like a famous supermodel, a politician, and a notorious gangster, and the three of them were in a car together, got into an accident, and the police had to be called. And there was no way to explain why these three people should be in a car together. And this blew up like an entire web of corruption and literally the deep state. I believe this was in Turkey. And then it was found out that there was this entire sub government that was actually in control no matter what the purported government was doing. And then when you find out about things like Operation Gladio, what the CIA and the intelligence agencies actually do, you find that that's actually true for many more countries. And it's most importantly true for the US, which is the one empire that exists and then controls so many other countries. So this next section here is a web of deception. On August 26th, the prosecutor of Bologna issued arrest warrants for 26 NAR members who were interrogated in Ferrara, Rome, Padua, and Parma. All thanks to the intervention of SIS-MI, were released from custody. Gelli and his fellow gladiators were now forced to lead investigators in the wrong direction by bringing forward believable suspects. The web of deception was allegedly woven by Michael Ledeen, a U.S. operative who worked closely with P2-controlled SIS-MI. So SIS-MI was this Italian agency. I can't remember what the acronym stands for. Ledeen, at the time, was serving at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, a think tank that had been established by the CIA. In 1981, Henry Kissinger maintained an office at CSIS along with Zbigniew Brzezinski, who served as National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter from 1977 to 81. The carefully constructed new report, which was leaked to the Italian press by SIS-MI, placed the blame for the bombing on a group of international terrorists known as the European National Fascists, whose leader was Karl-Heinz Hoffmann. Hoffmann's group, the phony report alleged, had been trained for the attack in Lebanon by Salah Khalif, also known as Abu Ayyad, a leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization. This report seemed credible. 8 weeks after the Bologna bombing on September 26th, a member of Hoffmann's group had blown himself up at the Oktoberfest in Munich, killing 12 others and wounding 215. A week later in Paris, a bomb planted by the group in front of a synagogue had killed 4 persons and wounded 13. This explanation might have held, despite the fact that it was denied by the PLO and could not be verified by prosecutor Aldo Gentile, who made several trips to Lebanon. Okay. So they're obviously trying to throw all the suspicion at this one direction when it's obviously not the case. Again, like the car accident, how do you explain that these members of this literal terrorist fascist organization were present and not members of the other one that you were supposedly blaming? This next section here is called the Uncovered List. But too many mistakes had been made. Nagging questions remained about the composition for, the mysterious arm stumps, and the collective testimony of the suspects who had been taken into custody from 1969 to 1980, the so-called, quote, years of lead. Annie Di Piombo, a reference to the number of bullets that were fired during this decade. Oh, okay, that's years of lead in Italian. What's more, on March 7th, 1981, a raid on Licio Gelli's villa uncovered a list of 962 P2 members that included top Italian intelligence, military, media, and political officials in SIS-MI, along with several prominent Argentines. Some of the more interesting names were as follows: Silvio Berlusconi, businessman, future founder of the Forza Italia political party, and future Prime Minister of Italy, Michele Sindona, Roberto Calvi, Umberto Ortolani, Franco De Bella, director of Corriere della Sera, the leading Italian daily newspaper, Angelo Rizzoli Jr., owner of Corriere della Sera Bruno Tassandin. This looks like it's another one of those paragraphs where he just goes on and on listing names and what they do. So I'm going to skip through some of that, but it's a lot of high up people. You have General Director of Corriere della Sera General, Chief of the Italian Army Intelligence Service, leader of an intelligence cell, Ufficio Affari Riservati. These are all very high up officials, like we were explaining in the previous sentence, that they're all well-to-do people in government, media, military, politics. Emilio Messera, and so it's continuing here. This goes on to the next page. This is a very long list of Italian people and their roles. The publication of the names created a national furor that resulted in the collapse of the government of Arnaldo Forlani, Italy's prime minister. The Italian people were aghast to learn that their most powerful political, military, and media leaders were members of the clandestine lodge. But the discovery did not directly link the lodge with the Bologna bombing or the other attacks that had taken place during the years of lead. That link would be eventually found in the Rome airport within the suitcase of Gelli's daughter. The two documents outlining the master plan of the Masonic group, coupled with the top secret U.S. Army document, were enough to convince Judge Felice Casson and his team of investigators that P2 had been involved in the attacks and that the secret society was acting as a proxy for the CIA. So you couldn't have a more clear description of it. Like, again, the fact that like Americans just kind of think of Italy as a generally chaotic place, similarly to how they think of like the Middle East, how it's just like unable to maintain stable governance, and they never, in either case, attribute that to their own country's interference, its malevolent dealings in both those places. Like in both places, the instability is created and taken advantage of by the U.S. and its empire, and that is purposeful. So you have literally a collapse of the government because, like I mentioned before, this list of all the people who were members of the P2 Masonic Propaganda Due Lodge that is doing Operation Gladio, involved with the Vatican, involved with all the drug trafficking and the mafias. This gets discovered, and it is such a scandal, it collapses the Italian government. Uh, I'm assuming Banco Ambrosiano will come up again in the following paragraphs because that's also involved with the leaking of this list. Schiphol says, no way priests serve the interest of the imperialist. Yeah, it's almost like they work to maintain power structures because they benefit from them. So back to the book here. What's more, the investigators realized that the secret society, acting under orders of U.S. officials, had been initiating acts of terror throughout the Western world, and most particularly in Argentina, under the watchful eye, if not the blessing, of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who would ascend to the papal throne as Pope Francis I. So now we're on to Chapter 8, Gladio, South of the Border. Operation Condor is the code name given for intelligence collection on leftists, communists, and Marxists in the Southern Cone area. It was established between cooperating intelligence services in South America in order to eliminate Marxist terrorist activities in member countries, with Chile reportedly being the center of operations. Other participating members include Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Bolivia. Members showing the most enthusiasm to date have been Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile. U.S. Department of Defense document October 1st, 1976, from 1965 to 1981, scores of additional terrorist attacks by Gladio units took place in countries throughout Europe. Several of the more notable incidents are as follows. 1965, in Portugal, the CIA established Agenter Press, a stay-behind unit under the command of Captain Yves Guerin Serac. The unit was trained in covert action techniques, including hands-on bomb terrorism, silent assassination, subversion techniques, clandestine communication, and infiltration in colonial warfare. The unit was responsible for the murders of Humberto Delgado, founder of the left-wing Portuguese National Liberation Front, on February 13, 1965, Eduardo Mondlane, leader of the Frelimo independence movement in the Portuguese colony of Mozambique, on February 3, 1969, and Amilcar Cabral, the Marxist spokesman for African Party Independence Movement of Guinea and Cape Verde, on January 20, 1973. In 1967, Agenter Press guerrilla leaders traveled to Italy at the instigation of the CIA to train members of Avanguardia Nazionale in the use of explosives for the 1969 Piazza Fontana bombing. 1966, in France, President Charles de Gaulle denounced the secret warfare of the Pentagon and expelled the European headquarters of NATO. De Gaulle's actions were triggered by a series of attempts by the French Gladio unit to assassinate him. 1967, in Greece, the Hellenic raiding force, Lokos Orenon Katadromon, which had been integrated into Gladio, overthrew the Greek Defense Ministry, ousted the left-leaning Center Union of George Papandreou, and set up a military dictatorship. When the colonels who led the coup asked Gust Avrakotos, the leading CIA operative in Greece, what to do with Papandreou, he reportedly said, quote, "Shoot the motherfucker because he's going to come back to, quote, haunt you." They ignored this advice and, under heavy pressure from American academics, including John Kenneth Galbraith, agreed to release him. In 1974, Papandreou returned to Greece to form the Pan-Hellenic Socialist Movement. So he actually did come back to haunt them. It's so funny. Again, like, I also think that Greece generally gets regarded as by Americans as like a chaotic country that just somehow cannot maintain like a stable government or democracy. And once again, leaving out any American clandestine role in creating and then benefiting from that instability. Man, the bots are out in full force today. Sorry, guys. 1970, in Spain, Stefano della Chiai and other terrorists from Italy's stay-behind army became, quote, security consultants for General Francisco Franco's secret police, conducting over 1,000 violent attacks and committing an estimated 50 murders. Among their victims were members of the Euskadi ta Askatasuna, who had been fighting for Basque independence. After Franco's death in 1975, Della Chiai moved to Chile, where he set up, quote, death squads under CIA-installed dictator Augusto Pinochet. 1977, in Spain, the secret stay-behind army, with support of Italian right-wing terrorists, carried out the Atocha massacre, attacking a lawyer's office where members of the Workers' Commission trade union and the then clandestine Communist Party of Spain had gathered. 5 people were killed in the attack. 1980, in Turkey, the commander of the stay-behind army counter-guerrilla, General Kenan Evren, and the Grey Wolves, Turkey's Gladio unit, initiated yet another successful military coup to seize control of the government. Like Italy, Turkey remained a pivotal concern to Gladio during the Cold War. It guarded 1/3 of NATO's total borders with Warsaw Pact countries and maintained the largest armed forces in Europe. Knowing that a communist takeover of Turkey would be catastrophic, the Gladio forces, at the instigation of the CIA, opened fire on a rally of 1 million trade union supporters in Taksim Square. The massacre of 1977 resulted in the deaths of 38 demonstrators and the wounding of hundreds more. 1981, in Germany, a large stay-behind arsenal was discovered near the German village of Welsen in the Linneberger Heide. Right-wing extremists had used the arsenal in the previous year to carry out the Munich Oktoberfest massacre, in which 13 people were killed and 213 wounded. So that's like a more comprehensible list, because it's not just a bunch of foreign names, but those are all events during the years of lead that were undertaken by Gladio, and people just seem to not remember this. Like, this also seems to be like the common thread about like Marxists. It's like, if you become a Marxist, it's because you have the type of brain that at least remembers some semblance of all these interrelated and connected events and draws together like a pattern of this, as opposed to like most people who just see random news all day, every day, and don't make any kind of connections between all of these things. This next section here is Latins lean left. But Latin America emerged as an area of such nagging concern that the CIA, in tandem with the Vatican, launched Operation Condor as a Latin American version of Gladio. Like Gladio, the new undertaking arose from concern over the spread of communism that would spell disaster for U.S. political and economic concerns and Catholic teaching. The word communist by this time was applied so liberally and so loosely to revolutionary or radical regimes by U.S. intelligence that any government risked being so labeled if it advocated nationalization of private industry, particularly foreign-owned corporations, radical land reform, autarkic trade policies, acceptance of Soviet aid, or an anti-American foreign policy. So yeah, very loose definition of communism. And you'll find that that always happens when you have right-wingers. Like, they will define communism or socialism as anything they like, as long as it gives them some kind of reason or ability to oppose it, to murder the people advocating for it. They don't require themselves to be honest. This next section here is the game plan. The game plan of Operation Condor was developed, in part, in the 1950s at the Brazilian Advanced War College, Escola Superior de Guerra, a carbon copy of the U.S. National War College. The Advanced War College was responsible for national security studies, development of military strategy, and the implementation of the plan for, quote, nation building. This plan, adopted from the Pentagon and the U.S. Army's experience of reconstructing post-war Japan, stemmed from what Karl Haushofer called the quote, science of geopolitics. Brazilian geopolitics, as developed by the War College, was based on the premise of a permanent world war between the forces of communism and the West. Because by size and geographical position, Brazil dominated the South Atlantic, it had a duty to keep that part of the world, in the words of Woodrow Wilson, quote, safe for democracy and free enterprise. A corollary of this assertion was that Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay should become satellites of their much larger neighbor. That objective was eventually achieved by economic imperialism and, quote, living frontiers. That is, by Brazilian colonists invading poorly protected borderlands such as the upper Paraná River basin of Paraguay. Students at the Advanced War College, including Humberto Castelo Branco and Golbery de Cuta e Silva, were taught by U.S. military and intelligence officials, including Lieutenant Colonel Vernon Walters, the CIA's chief coup engineer. Yeah, this is quite literally it's like a franchise almost. Like they set up these branches, and they just keep replicating these orgs all around the world, and they refine their tactics. They get better at it with every iteration. Um, yeah, they're very good at doing this stuff. And if your organization is not equally iterative, self-critical, and updating itself, like in its revolutionary practices, like you're planning to lose. Like in 1964, the graduates of the college united into a junta that overthrew the democratically elected left-wing government of Jodo Goulart. Following the coup, Castelo Branco emerged as the new Brazilian president and Silva as the head of Brazil's first national intelligence service. The coup could not have been accomplished without the outlay of more than $20 million from the CIA. That also helps. Not only having like good organization tactics and like strict discipline about it, but like having literally millions and millions of dollars and just unlimited funding certainly helps. I feel like left wing orgs could get a lot more done if they had that kind of funding. You'd be able to motivate a lot more people to do your organizing bidding if you're able to pay them. The coup could not have been accomplished without the outlay of more than $20 million from the CIA, and the military officials who formed the junta were duly grateful. To show their appreciation, the officials accepted the entire package of U.S. demands, including a generous new profit remittance law and an investment guarantee treaty covering U.S. subsidiaries. Within 2 years of Goulart's overthrow, thanks to these concessions, foreign companies gained control of 50% of Brazilian industry, often through the expediency of what the Brazilian finance ministry called, quote, constructive bankruptcy, a combination of fiscal and monetary measures that forced local firms to sell to foreign interests or go broke. Man, doesn't that sound kind of like private equity? Doesn't that sound like what the financiers currently do, which is like buy up everything, force you to go broke if you refuse? Let's see much longer. Oh, I'm at 22 minutes, so I'm going to have to switch the books here. So bookmark this. And now I will switch over to Western Marxism. So let's see. The dehumanization of the colonial peoples is manifested in a way that is simultaneously flexible and repugnant. We can therefore understand the view of a 19th century author who would become dear to Nazism. Houston S. Chamberlain, while celebrating the dawn of the 20th century as, quote, the century of race and the century of colonies, mocked the, quote, so-called unity of the human race, which, in his view, science and history refuted, and which remained pathetically embraced only by the socialists. Later, the most illustrious ideologue of Nazis, Alfred Rosenberg, intoned against the dogma of a presumed, quote, general development of humanity, and ironically commented on the persistent influence of religion in Jewish mythology. The old Jehovah, quote, is now called humanity. It was a chapter of history that went well beyond Germany and Europe. The universalist pathos that resounded from the October Revolution and its appeal to the colonial slaves to break their chains was met with the theory of the, quote, Underman and Untermensch, the subhuman. It is a category that the American author Lothrop Stoddard would later formulate in a book soon translated into German that prescribes Hitler's campaign to colonize Eastern Europe, enslave the Slavs, and exterminate the Jews, along with the Bolsheviks, who were seen as ideologues and instigators of the revolt of the, quote, inferior races. Yeah, that is pretty much how all right-wingers think now. For Italian fascism, likewise committed to colonialist and racist counter-revolution, the abyss separating one, quote, race or nation from another was unbridgeable, to the point that, in Mussolini's eyes, expressions such as the human race were, quote, too evanescent, or even without meaning. Finally, in Asia, Japan continued its colonial expansion together with the dehumanization of the Chinese, who, from the late 19th century, had been represented as similar to beasts, often compared to apes or pigs. Certainly under pressure from denunciations that brought to light its inhuman character, colonialism was sometimes forced to assume a universalist guise. Historically, how did the protagonists of the movements for emancipation react? Dubois has no difficulty in noting that the universalist keywords, quote, peace, Christianity, commerce, used so often by the British Empire and the American Republic, coexisted with raging hatred for the darker races that they accused each other of. The fact was that colonialism and imperialism were, quote, built on the inhuman exploitation of human beings, considered to be, quote, outside of humanity. The struggle for universalism led to a confrontation with a socio-political system whose practice of dehumanization was intrinsic. The communist movement's position was no different. Lenin called attention to the fact that, in the eyes of the West, the victims of the war and of colonial expansionism, quote, don't even deserve the appellation of peoples. Perhaps the Asians and Africans are peoples? They were excluded from the human community. So, yeah, it's wild. This is like the level of dehumanization that is implicit in all of, quote, liberal democracy. This is like why all the Western, quote, leftist or progressive movements are complicit in genocide of brown people and then focus on, I don't know, reformism, implementing more free stuff and social programs at home rather than actually overturning the system of colonialism and imperialism. It's not their goal. Their goal is to just um, slightly reform stuff around the edges, try to make things better for themselves, and then they engage in all these weird mental gymnastics when you say that that is not revolutionary, it's not anti-imperialist, and then they start saying things, well, maybe if we make things better for the people here, they'll start getting more revolutionary. And that has quite literally never happened. So this is very Christian-like, yeah. Gramsci was even more explicit. Writing in the 1930s, he observed that even for a philosopher such as Henry Bergson, quote, in reality, humanity means West. This is how the champions of the, quote, defense of the West argue, and is the dominant culture in the West. Communism, instead, was synonymous with, quote, integral humanism, a humanism that challenged the prejudices and the arrogance of the, quote, white supermen. In other words, pseudo-universality, which consists of the arbitrary upgrading to a universal of a particular and often vicious determinant, is frequently masked by recourse to a truer and richer meta-universality. That's one of those sentences that I have a real hard time parsing, but the first half of it sounded great. It sounded exactly like what I was saying about the differences between the Western racist Marxism and the Eastern effective one. Althusser's idealist and Eurocentric regression, section 5 here. While politically compromising understanding of the great socio-political struggles of contemporary history, theoretically, anti-humanism leads to two relevant and quite negative consequences. Marx more than once insisted that this theory was the theoretical expression of real processes and movements of a real class struggle. With Althusser, instead historical materialism and the real movement that it contributed to and promoted were the result of an, quote, epistemological break. Just as for Della Volpe, they are the result of a scientific method that is the fruit of the teachings of Galileo and before him Aristotle, the critic of Plato. And so we encounter an idealist distortion of historical materialism, which came to us thanks to the work of one individual who discovered a new continent. Following the discovery of, quote, the continent of mathematics by the Greeks, Marx launched the discovery of, quote, continent history. After having repeatedly accused humanism of obscuring the class struggle, Althusser, together with Della Volpe, would make the class struggle vanish from historical materialism. I wonder if this is where, like, the national question that Lenin posits comes in. I believe it's Lenin started talking about the national question in relation to Marxism. This idealistic regression was, at the time, a Eurocentric regression. In Marx and Engels, a historical materialism presupposed, on the one hand, the Industrial Revolution, and on the other, political revolution, starting with the French Revolution. Neither of these revolutions is exclusively European. The former led to the formation of the world market, to colonial expansion, to the original accumulation of capital. The latter saw one of its highest points in the rising of the black slaves of Saint-Domingue and in the abolition of colonial slavery decreed in Paris by the Jacobin Convention. With Althusser, as with Della Volpe, the development of historical materialism is a chapter of intellectual history conducted exclusively in Europe. We can well understand the reasons for the attitude taken by the French philosopher. These were the years when the banner of, quote, humanism was waved to mute the struggle against imperialism. It began the process that would later lead to Gorbachev's capitulation. Looking carefully, we see that the philosophical critique of humanism, which tended to obscure social conflict, was a way to distance oneself from the, quote, conceptions tainted with reformism and opportunism, or quite simply revisionist, that were widespread during these years. Yeah, so much of this book so far is quite simply describing the divide between the Eastern and Western Marxism, and then explaining how that came to be. Like, and that's definitely what he's talking about here. Unfortunately, this polemic took off from an erroneous position. In the first place, it is worth keeping in mind that the appeal to the human community and to morality and the call to science can lead to forgetting the class struggle. However, the French philosopher quite rightly took a position against the phrase that, condemning the interclassist view of science, counterposed, quote, proletarian science to, quote, bourgeois science. He recognized Stalin's merit in being opposed to the, quote, zeal of those who, quote, were making strenuous efforts to prove language an ideological superstructure. Thanks to these few simple pages, concludes Althusser, quote, we could see that there were limits to the use of the class criterion that we had been made to treat science a status claimed by every page of Marx. And as far as morality is concerned, to put on the same plane positions that demanded the unity of the human race and positions that denied and mocked it, to argue in the name of a self-styled purely proletarian class struggle, meant losing sight of the real class struggle, based on the dehumanization of large masses of human beings, degraded to Untermenschen, and destined only to be oppressed, enslaved, or annihilated. Arguing against a humanist reading of Marxism, Althusser never tired of repeating that Marx did not start from, quote, man, or the, quote, individual, but from the historical structures and social relations. However, it's clear that the concept of man or the individual is taken for granted. In reality, the concept of the individual and man as such, independent of sex, status, or skin color, is the result of the centuries-long struggle for recognition conducted under the banner of humanism so disparaged by Althusser. That also goes for women, considered by nature incapable of being political actors and thinkers and of engaging in intellectually skilled work. For the waged workers of the metropoles, reduced to instruments of labor, to bipedal machines, and to pack animals, and in a particular way to the colonized peoples, dehumanized in every way. The French philosopher recognized that a, quote, revolutionary humanism could also be born from the October Revolution. But on this point, he is somewhat hesitant, so he precludes the understanding of the gigantic struggle conducted by the slaves of the colonies, to use a phrase dear to Lenin, and aimed at gaining recognition of their human dignity. It's also hard for me to tell from reading that last paragraph whether he is flattening the struggle or he is recognizing all the different aspects of class struggle and how they present differently in different categories of people, whether it's like race or gender. Althusser considered the category of man to be compromised by interclassism and incapable of calling attention to the reality of exploitation and oppression. But here he made a second theoretical error. There are no terms that in themselves can express it, that in themselves can express in a pure state social and political antagonisms. There are no ideologically and politically, quote, pure terms that were always and only utilized by revolutionaries and only in a revolutionary way. In the United States in the 19th century, quote, democratic referred to the party committed to defending the enslavement of blacks and the regime of white supremacy. This is also true for the categories that seem to be inextricably intertwined with the history of the workers' movement. In France, after the 1848 revolution, the banner of, quote, labor and respect for the, quote, dignity of labor began to be waved by conservatives committed to denouncing as idle and as bums revolutionary agitators or workers on strike to improve their living and working conditions. Further along this road than anyone else is Hitler, who in the name of the party he founded and led, sets himself up as the champion of, quote, socialism and the German workers. Notwithstanding their different starting points, Althusser comes to the same conclusions as Tronti. The Italian author never tires of restating that, quote, universalism is the classical bourgeois vision of man. Fortunately, there are the workers. Quote, with them, and only with them, we can finally leave behind universal values because from their point of view, these are always ideologically bourgeois. In the place of universalism, Althusser takes aim at humanism, but we are in the presence of the same outlook. Without being aware of it, he ends up embellishing his target with a critique that nevertheless seeks to be intransigent and to eschew all compromise. I'm actually still not clear what that common position between Tronti and Althusser is, other than ending up sticking up for the bourgeois and the capitalists without realizing it, while claiming to take a far left position. In reality, stamping universalism or humanism as in itself, quote, bourgeois, or inclined to compromise with the bourgeoisie, means halting the critique of capitalist society halfway. It means reproaching the purely formal nature of civil and political rights, whose owner should be humanity as such, in its universality, but without mention of the frightening exclusion that deprives colonial peoples, or peoples of colonial origin, of civil and political rights, and economic and social rights. That is, it glosses over the colonial condition, which also, in Marx's view, reveals par excellence the barbarity of capitalist society. In that case, the dehumanizing character of the existing order was revealed in all its brutality and ended up manifesting itself explicitly, and was confirmed in a particularly sensational way in the United States, where theories of racial inferiority preceded the theory of the quote, underman or Untermensch. In other words, Togliatti was much more consequential and radical when he denounced the quote, barbaric discrimination between human creatures, on which capitalist society is founded. Yeah, it seems like we're definitely like reiterating over and over again how the Western Marxisms kind of take for granted the exploitation of colonial peoples, um, marginalized people in their own country, and while claiming to fight for that, end up making some kind of arguments for mild reforms, um, which end up going disproportionately to the already privileged anyway. Um, and then they use whatever kind of crazy mental gymnastics and excuses they can come up with for saying that this is the true Marxism, not the revolutionary kind that refuses to compromise within bourgeois electoralism. So, Schill says recognizing it has nothing to do, but with class identification. It's oddly specific in history. If you claim to be socialist, you're not a socialist. Yeah, I would agree with that. If you're saying that you're a socialist, it probably means that you're scared of actual communism, and you're going to turn. You're basically just a liberal, and you're going to end up siding with the capitalists the whenever an inflection point gets strong enough. That's basically what you're seeing all the time. Like you're seeing just with every day different inflection points, different events, and people are taking one or another side, and people are outing themselves as liberals or actual Marxists depending on which side they're choosing. And that's what's causing all this like quote unquote infighting. It's really liberals exposing themselves as liberals and then not wanting to change their mind or their position, and so doubling down, and then I don't know, engaging in these increasingly tortured, like what do you call it, like distortions of the ideology of Marxism to claim that they are the true Marxists by uh, voting, by doing liberal praxis. So, section 6 here, Bloch's legacy and the transfiguration of liberalism. Notwithstanding their passionate denunciation of universalism and of humanism, which substantially eliminates the colonial question, Tronti and Althusser end up paradoxically converging on the position of Bloch, who from the start credited without hesitation both universalism and humanism to the Western liberalism he loved to boast about. During the First World War, we have seen that the German philosopher endorsed the ideology of the Entente, which claimed it wanted to bring the Central Powers and the entire world to the very democracy that was obstinately denied to the colonial peoples. The liberal West was counterposed positively by Bloch to not only the Germany of Wilhelm II, but also the country born of the October Revolution. On the latter, the young philosopher expressed a severe judgment without waiting for the withdrawal from Russia of the German army, or even less, for the end of the Civil War. Quote, the proletarians of the world have not fought for 4.5 years against Prussia in the name of worldwide democracy, to then abandon freedom and the democratic line, the pride of Western culture, in the name of the conquest of socioeconomic democracy, referring to Soviet Russia. As this last passage suggests, he made a comparison to the North American Republic. Quote, with the admiration for Wilson, already one could think as socialists that it would have been possible that the son of Washington would one day supersede the awaited son of Moscow, that freedom and purity could come from capitalist America. Again, it's just like they're always just doing these weird leaps to equate Soviet Russia with any of the powers that it's antagonistic to, so that they can take this like middling milk toast, like uh, just inconsequential position of everything's fine and we are leading the true revolution from here in the West under colonialism when they're not doing anything. There is a duplicitous erasure at work here. We pass over the fact that the war provoked a climate of terror and witch hunts in the countries where the liberal tradition was most firmly rooted, and that thanks to their geographic location, were a safe distance from the battlefields or from the threat of invasion. The most serious erasure, however, concerned the colonial question. Only a few years earlier, the United States that Bloc celebrated put down through merciless repression and genocidal practices the Revolution for Independence in the Philippines. On its own territory between the 19th and 20th centuries, a terrorist regime of white supremacy repeatedly subjected black people to lynchings, to torture and slow and interminable execution, staged as a mass spectacle for the festive white community. Yeah, I think I'm at 40 minutes here, so I'm going to bookmark this one as well. We'll stop here for the day on this book, and I'll pick up with the Peter Dale Scott book. So again, this is Drugs, Oil, and War by Peter Dale Scott. So picking right back here. We can take his words as prophecy now fulfilled. Let's see, what was the previous thing? I'm going to read the previous paragraph just so we can get the quote that he's referring to. The strengthening of the global narcotics traffic has fueled other smuggling and related criminal activities, leading to the consolidation of an international criminal milieu. Chinese triads, Japanese yakuza, Russian gangs, and the mafias of Italy, America, and Colombia have now combined into a worldwide criminal consortium that is, according to experts, growing exponentially. Delegates to a global crime conference in November 1994 were informed that organized crime generates $750 billion annually. Many of these illicit dollars end up corrupting markets, institutions, businessmen, and of course politicians. Writing in 1997 of his experience exposing BCCI, Senator John Kerry concluded that, quote, "Today, globalized crime can rob the U.S. not only of our money, but also of our way of life." Okay. So we can take his words as a prophecy now fulfilled. Although Al-Qaeda and the Taliban might appear on the surface to exemplify, quote, "a clash of civilizations," their activities were paid for, as noted above, by heroin and other transactions at the very heart of this global crime milieu that transcends religious boundaries. Boy, does it. I'll recall that in the Gladio book, we repeatedly talk about how people in the Catholic Church, especially in the high up in the Vatican, were forbidden from becoming Freemasons. Like, it was told that you will literally go to hell. You are sacrificing your soul if you join the Freemasons. Nevertheless, all of the high up Vatican officials were P2 Masonic members. Accelerating U.S. dependency on international oil and petrodollars in the context of globalization and war. And I'll keep in mind, this has also flipped again. Like, in the time since this book was written in the early 2000s, now the U.S. is like the main exporter of oil because they loosened all the regulations. They bought up enough companies and subsidiaries. They control enough territory worldwide that they call it U.S. territory, even if it's nowhere near the continental U.S. And then the fracking and everything at home. So this has totally changed. Like, they are starting to, I guess, reverse the globalization. Just keep that in mind when I'm reading these next few chapters. At the height of the Vietnam War, with inflation threatening to wreck his domestic program for a, quote, great society, Lyndon Johnson relaxed the import quota system that had been introduced by Eisenhower to protect domestic U.S. oil production. This increased U.S. vulnerability pressure from OPEC oil boycotts in the 1970s. And that vulnerability would be further heightened after Nixon abolished quotas altogether in 1973. The United States handled the quadrupling of oil prices in the 1970s by arranging, by means of secret agreements with the Saudis, to recycle petrodollars back into the U.S. economy. The first of these deals assured a special and ongoing Saudi stake in the health of the U.S. dollar. The second secured continuing Saudi support for the pricing of all OPEC oil in dollars. These two deals assured that the U.S. economy would not be impoverished by OPEC oil price hikes. The heaviest burdens would be borne instead by the economics of less developed countries. From these developments emerged the twin phenomena underlying 9/11. One, triumphalist U.S. unilateralism on the one hand, and global third world indebtedness on the other. The secret deals increased U.S. Saudi interdependence at the expense of international comity that had been the basis of U.S. prosperity since World War II. They also increased Saudi leverage on U.S. foreign policy, as was seen in the 1979 sale of F-15 fighter planes to Saudi Arabia against strong Israeli opposition. In particular, they explained why George Bush moved so swiftly in 1990 to counter the threat posed by Saddam Hussein to U.S.-Saudi security in the Persian Gulf. The threat was not just that the United States itself would lose oil from the Gulf, against which it was partially insured by the redundancy in world oil supplies. A bigger threat was that Saddam would become the dominant power in the Persian Gulf, directly controlling 20% of OPEC production and 25% of world oil reserves. The U.S. Saudi deals also increased U.S. dependence on oil and drug funded Arab assets such as BCCI, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which in the 1980s became a chief paymaster for the anti Soviet Afghan Mujahideen and even ran arms directly to them from Karachi. The failure of the U.S. government to investigate and prosecute BCCI reflected not only the extent of BCCI penetration of the U.S. ruling circles, but also U.S. economic dependence on the continued influx of petrodollars and narco-dollars. As former NSC economist commented, Treasury Secretary James Baker didn't pursue BCCI because he thought a prosecution of the bank would damage the United States' reputation as a safe haven for flight capital and overseas investment. So yeah, the United States is known to the right people, sort of like Switzerland, like a Swiss bank, or the Cayman Islands for like being this haven where you can put vast sums of money with secrecy and no accountability, especially if they are illegal, illicit funds. And they didn't want to, the regulators, like the literal people who investigate this such thing, did not want to damage that U.S. reputation for being that. Some had expected that the successful OPEC revolt in the 1970s against Washington's and London's economic policies would presage a, quote, new economic order that would strengthen the South vis-a-vis the North. The secret Saudi-U.S. deals led to a different outcome, a, quote, new world order that saw increasing U.S. military dominance combined with increasing economic instability and occasional crises elsewhere. Statistics reveal the change in direction. Between 1960 and 1980, per capita income grew 73% in Latin America and 34% in Africa. Between 1980 and 2000, income grew less than 6% in Latin America and declined by 23% in Africa. So that's like literally talking about the instability that I was just mentioning in the other two books. Like the U.S. creates the instability and then indoctrinates everyone to believe that this is just a natural thing that happens in these other countries as they benefit from that instability. Schulz says it's very symbolic to Stalin not being a self-proclaimed Stalinist because that in itself is Eurocentric. Yeah, that is also true. This loss of economic stability and momentum, combined with political impotence in the face of U.S. military hegemony, are of course root factors to be addressed in any serious effort to combat terrorism. This next section here is U.S. wars in the light of the international drug trade. The examples cited above of drug factors underlying U.S. interventions illustrate what I mean by deep politics. The point is not to suggest that the increase in drug consumption was a conscious aim of high-level U.S. planning, but that it was a direct consequence of policy decisions. There are, however, grounds for considering a different question. Did successive crises in the illicit drug traffic induce some drug trafficking U.S. interest groups and allies to press successfully for U.S. involvement in an Asian war? This is a question asked in my book, The War, although I had partly retreated from this question by the time I finished the book in 1971. Conspicuous recent developments have persuaded me to revive it today. I have no evidence that the U.S. government intervened militarily as a conscious means of maintaining control over the global drug traffic. However, conscious decisions were definitely made, time after time, to ally the United States with local drug proxies. The U.S. motives for doing so were usually to minimize the cost and exposure of direct engagement. However, the drug proxies and their associates appear to have exploited these conditions of non-accountability with escalations to meet their own drug agendas, particularly at moments when the survival of the drug traffic was threatened. And again, if you are coming from the Gladio book, you'll see that, yeah, the U.S. absolutely did act directly to make a lot of that stuff happen. The whole history of the United States and in the Far East since World War II has involved from the beginning a drug trafficking proxy, the KMT, that from the days of the China lobby had obtained or purchased significant support within the U.S. political establishment. Although the picture is a complex one defying reduction, one can certainly see the role of the China lobby as a factor in the events leading to America's first war on the Asian mainland, the Korean War in 1950. This was right after the victorious armies of Mao Zedong began to eliminate Chinese opium, the source of 85% of the world's heroin. Furthermore, drugs from the regions where the CIA has been active have tended to migrate through other countries of CIA penetration, and more importantly, through and to agencies and groups that can be classified as CIA assets. In the 1950s, opium from Indochina traveled through Iran and Lebanon to the Corsican Mafia in Marseille and the Sicilian Mafia under Lucky Luciano. This is just straight up Gladio stuff. This is like quite literally right out of that book. It's always good to see it confirmed in multiple sources, in case you're still in doubt that any of this is like just veritable fact. In the 1980s, Mujahideen heroin was reaching the Sicilian Mafia via the Turkish Grey Wolves, who worked in tandem with the Turkish Army's counter-guerrilla organization, which functioned as the Turkish branch of the CIA's multinational stay behind. The routes shifted with the politics of the times, but the CIA denominator remained constant. The following sections examine moments in which U.S. wars were deeply intertwined with the world drug traffic, beginning with the most recent. 2001. In October 2001, a UN report confirmed that the Taliban had successfully eliminated the year's opium production in Afghanistan, which in recent years had supplied 90% of Europe's heroin. However, it appears that what would have been the world's largest curtailment of opium production in half a century has now been reversed. Following the defeat of the Taliban, that's funny in retrospect now. Following the defeat of the Taliban, farmers began replanting wheat fields with opium poppy, and it is now estimated that in 2002, opium harvest is about 3,700 tons, 34 metric tons, or more than the 2000 harvest, I guess. On October 16, 2001, the United Nations Office for Drug Control and Crime Prevention released its Afghanistan Annual Opium Poppy Survey for 2001. It reported that the 2000 ban on opium imposed by the Taliban was almost universally enforced. This estimated 2001 crop of 185 metric tons was only 6% of Afghanistan's 2000 total of 3,276 tons, which had been more than half of the world's output. Over 90% of the 2001 crop came from provinces under the control of America's eventual ally, the Northern Alliance, where the area under cultivation radically increased. Helmand province under the Taliban, the highest cultivating area in 2000, recorded no poppy cultivation in the 2001 season. So yeah, basically just reiterating over and over here that the Taliban was very successful in eliminating poppy cultivation, heroin production from Afghanistan, which had previously supplied like the vast majority of Europe's heroin. And then as soon as the U.S. got rid of them, that was their main goal. And like it seems like that was a huge task right there, was to get that ramped back up. And they did. The UN ODCCP report further noted that the approximately 3,100 ton reduction in 2001 opium production in Afghanistan compared to 2000 was not offset by increases in other countries. As Jane's Intelligence Review, October 22, 2001 noted, quote, the ban imposed by the Taliban Supreme Leader Mullah Muhammad Omar in July 2000 resulted in some 70% of the world's illicit opium production being wiped out virtually at a stroke. Those skeptical about Mullah Omar's motives for the ban speculated that the Taliban held substantial reserves of processed opium and wished to drive up prices. Nevertheless, even the U.S. State Department reported in March 2002 that the Taliban's ban had been remarkably successful, reducing total Afghan opium production from 3,656 tons in 2000 to 74 tons in 2001. More credible explanations stress the Taliban's efforts to gain legitimacy and recognition from the United States and other nations, a policy that proved abortive. Despite the ban, Afghanistan remained, in the words of the report, one of the world's leading opium producers by virtue of continued cultivation in its northern provinces, controlled by the Northern Alliance. As the Taliban was ousted from province after province in 2001, starving farmers everywhere started to replant the one lucrative crop available to them, often at the behest of local commanders. The crop augured the return of warlordism to Afghanistan. Regional commanders and armies, financed by the opium in their area, jealously refusing to relinquish such a lucrative income source to a central government. Thus, there could be a revival of the vicious internecine feuds that took so many civilian lives in the 1990s after the Soviet withdrawal. So yeah, again, the U.S. removing the Taliban, who of course themselves are like not going to be good actors, they're not good people, but they did one good thing, which is get rid of the opium production. Like they're just doing away with heroin, and that is not in the U.S. interest, as we can see. Like they don't want that to be done. Shibboleth says, strange that poppy fields popped up after the U.S. after USA imperialist overthrows. Yeah, this keeps happening. This is another tried and true pattern we see. The London Observer on November 25th, 2001, reported that, quote, Western and Pakistani officials fear that within a year or two, Afghanistan could again reach its peak production figures of 60,000 hectares of poppies producing 2,800 tons of opium, more than half of the world's output. It reported further on December 10th, 2001, quote, with the Taliban gone, Afghanistan's farmers are going back to their old lucrative ways. In the tribal areas of Pakistan, where most of the opium is processed, prices have plummeted in expectation of a bumper crop. The Financial Times London reported February 18, 2002, quote, the US and United Nations have ignored repeated calls by the international anti-drug community to address the increasing menace of Afghanistan's opium cultivation, threatening a rift between Europe and the US as they begin to reconstruct the country. The initial failure of the U.S. press to report or comment on these developments was an ominous sign that the U.S. government might be prepared to see its former I don't know what that word is supposed to be, its former projects maybe, finance themselves once again through the drug traffic. More ominous was active disinformation by officials of the U.S. government. The Taliban's drastic reduction in opium cultivation was ignored, and indeed misrepresented, by CIA Director George Tenet in his report to Congress on February 7, 2001, in a speech that threatened retaliatory strikes against the Taliban. Quote, production in Afghanistan has been exploding, accounting for 72% of illicit global opium trade production in 2000. The drug threat is increasingly intertwined with other threats. For example, the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which allows bin Laden and other terrorists to operate on its territory, encourages and profits from the drug trade. So again, this is like this other pattern that we've seen over and over again, which the U.S. either out of whole cloth creates the drug trade, or they enable it, and then they blame it on the enemies. They blame it on the people they are fighting, who are actually the ones curbing that drug trade. They did it with China, like Mao's soldiers were fighting the KMT. The KMT were the primary source of the heroin. The U.S. was profiting from helping them traffic it, and then they were using that money to fight the Chinese communists. And then the whole time they were blaming the heroin coming into the U.S. that they were trafficking it. They were blaming it on Chinese communism. It's exactly the same situation you see today with Chinese fentanyl supposedly coming in from Mexico. It's obviously the U.S. that is profiting from the sale of these illegal drugs and trafficking, and then blaming it on anyone that they want to start a fight with. And even the previous few paragraphs, in case that wasn't clear, it was the Taliban who was getting rid of the opium production, and in the areas that were controlled by the Northern Alliance, which was the U.S. proxies, that's where the opium was still being produced. So they were blaming this on the Taliban, even though they were doing it. On January 17, 2002, Afghanistan's new leader, Hamid Karzai, issued a new ban on opium poppy cultivation and promised to work with donors to ensure it could be implemented. However, as the State Department reported, quote, whether factions will follow a ban on poppy cultivation issued by the interim authority is uncertain. The Northern Alliance, for example, has so far as the U.S. is aware, taken no action against cultivation and trafficking in the area it controls. There have also been recent reports of farmers cultivating a second opium crop in the Northern Alliance-controlled areas. As a result, drugs have continued to flow north into Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, where they finance Islamist radical groups. Author-journalist Ahmed Rashid has reported on the conviction of Tajik officials that the main drug finance group they faced, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, IMU, was being covertly assisted by Russia, quote, because Moscow was trying to pressure Uzbek dictator Karimov into accepting Russian troops and greater Russian influence in Uzbekistan. Other Tajik officials claimed that the IMU was supported by Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, who were backing Islamic movements in Central Asia in order to gain leverage in the region. Rashid himself confirms both Saudi funds and ISI, quote, discreet support for the IMU, adding that senior ISI officials are convinced that the IMU has close intelligence links to Russia. Another boogeyman that they conveniently blame whenever the US is doing dastardly shit, drug trafficking, human atrocities, like war crimes, whatever it is they're doing. It's always convenient to accuse Russia of doing that. We are still waiting for a clearer American resolve to deal with the restored drug flows it has created, for adequate funds to restore the shattered Afghan economy, and for a firm commitment to address the problem of warlordism. Until then, it can only be concluded that once again, the United States is unprepared to challenge the drug politics of its proxies in the region. Perhaps there are some in the US government who, like their Russian counterparts, accept the corruption of the Central Asian states through drugs as a means of increasing influence over politicians there. No way. Could you imagine such a situation? So yeah, since we're going backwards in chronological order there, so that was all from around 2001. Now we're going to 1979. The situation in 2001 recreated many elements of the 1980s, when, in the words of the Washington Post, May 13, 1990, U.S. officials ignored heroin trafficking by the Mujahideen because U.S. narcotics policy in Afghanistan has been subordinated to the war against Soviet influence there. The consequences of that official toleration of trafficking have been summarized vividly by Michael Griffin. Quote, by the mid-1980s, the processing and export of heroin had created a black economy in Pakistan of about $8 billion, half the size of the official one, and Pakistan's military administration was showing signs of evolving into a fully blown narco-government. The number of Pakistani addicts, meanwhile, had spiraled from nil in 1979 to between 1.2 and 1.7 million at the end of 1988. Such a rapid rate would have been impossible without the protection or active collaboration of the ISI, which, empowered by CIA funding and arms deliveries, had grown from a small military department into a modern intelligence network with a staff of 150,000 and hundreds of millions of dollars a year at its disposal. The U.S. colluded in the development of this new heroin source for fear of undermining the CIA's work in alliance for the Mujahideen. Yeah, so again, the U.S. is quite literally responsible for at least partially destabilizing Pakistan, but getting millions of people addicted to heroin there. Many authors besides Griffin have seen this enormous expansion of the drug trade as a byproduct of the anti-Soviet war. But there are signs that opium traffickers did more than just profit from the war. They may have helped induce it. It is certain that the buildup of opium and heroin production, along with the Afghan-Pakistan frontier, was not a consequence of the war. It preceded it. What is particularly eye-catching is that in 1979, just as in 2001, the war helped avert what would otherwise have been an acute drop in world opium production from earlier heights. Okay, so it's convenient that they have this conflict that nobody really wants or has any interest in, but the one effect of that conflict is that the opium production does not take a dip, it does not stop or slow down in any way whatsoever. Schibble says, it's the shooting the person on the couch meme and then blaming them. Yeah, exactly. All right, so I'm at an hour and 3 minutes here, so I'm going to bookmark this one as well. And that'll be done for the day. Thank you all again for joining me for the reading hour. I'll put this one out on the podcast feed in a couple of days. And then tonight, turn your notifications on. Check it out because it's 7 o'clock tonight, Eastern Time. I will be live streaming with Joseph and Jared from the Old True Crime to the Empire show. And we're just going to talk about some recent news events. We've all been itching just to talk about that kind of stuff. So we're going to do a quick live stream. Talk about news events tonight. So please tune in for that. And then that will also come out on the podcast feed. So once again, thank you all for joining. Appreciate it.